I want to say hello to everybody who has joined us for this session. My name is Kirsten Andreasen, and I thank you so much for joining us for the spotlight session on the many ways to slice a juicy historical data pie, exploring and comparing 4 tools to import historical data. Wow, I'm hungry just reading that title. So DHIS2 and the community have developed numerous overlapping solutions for migrating legacy data into a new DHIS2 instance. These include the native API and import-export tool, BulkLoad, DataZ, which is a BAO Systems Data Importer, and Biff, which is the BAO Systems Import Foundry. So for an agriculture project in Egypt, Abt Associates discovered both advantages and gaps related to each of these tools, and they ultimately achieved success by combining products and approaches. Our speakers will walk us through the process and tool analysis and share the lessons learned. So I know you're all wondering, who are our speakers? So we have Tony Iha Kazungu, who is a lead DHIS2 solutions architect at Abt Associates and leads the organization's technical deployment of DHIS2. His favorite pie is Nyama Joma, which is a roast pie that's eaten in Kenya. Brandon Cornell is an enterprise business intelligence lead and is a data visualization specialist at Abt Associates, with a passion for enabling non-technical users to explore data and present their findings in intuitive, beautiful ways. Since it is autumn in New England in the United States, he told me that his favorite pie this time of year is apple pie. So now, without further ado, I turn it over to Tony and Brandon from Abt Associates. And oh, sorry, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Abt Associates, for being a silver sponsor of the DHIS2 Symposium, because without your generous support, we wouldn't be able to have the symposium. So thank you. So now over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kirsten, for the introduction. I guess with that, probably I'll speak the part of introducing ourselves. You've done some nice work of introducing ourselves. So I'll share my screen. Okay, so here we are. So that's our main topic, the many ways to slice a juicy historical data pie, which I'm going to take you through with my colleague Brandon. Maybe briefly I can just do that small introduction and also acknowledge Matt Boddy, one of our colleagues who actually came in handy during the troubleshooting processes and introduced us to the DataZ import tool. And with that, briefly about myself, I've been with Abt Associates for 1 year now. My background, I'm in software engineering for the last 15 years. I've worked with DHIS2 for about 8 years now. So that's kind of my brief introduction. Maybe I'll ask Brandon also to briefly tell us about himself before I jump to the main business.
Thanks, Tony. I'm Brandon Cornell. I have been with Abt Associates for about 3 years. I'm an enterprise business intelligence lead, but I am also a data visualization specialist. So I do a lot of work in data viz. Been working in analytics for about 2 decades now, and managing the analytics infrastructure, part of the analytics infrastructure here at Abt, and collaborating with Tony and the Amy team on some of our DHIS2 implementations here.
Okay, thank you. So I'll jump over to the next slide. This is just an overview of what we'll be talking about. Our brief agenda, we'll talk about the project briefly, share with you how we went about to do the DHIS2 configuration, and then I'll give you an overview of the data import tools, and later on you see how the historical data was prepared for the import process through to the migration into DHIS2, and then we'll go into a summary and lessons that were learned from this process. Right, so as it has been mentioned, the project is a Feed the Future Rural Agribusiness Strengthening Project, which is a US agency for international development effort to improve the livelihood of farmers in Egypt through a variety of methods, including providing training, coordinating financial assistance, and promoting new technologies. So the project had been operating for 2 years, and they've been using open source encrypted forms and MySQL databases for collecting their data. Briefly, just to understand the legacy architecture. So they've been using the ODK forms, and throughout this, the process realized that ODK comes with some inflexibility when it comes to forms. If the forms are changed, then you realize that you are left with 2 sets of forms and kind of 2 sets of data. This data is stored in a MySQL database. When it comes to reporting, it was somewhat cumbersome because we had to create a number of procedures within MySQL which were quite not that friendly in terms of interacting and pulling out reports. So with this background of that legacy system, it was deemed fit to kind of move to transition to DHIS2 so that we could take advantage of the analytics features and the nice interface for the team to be able to work on that. So that was the legacy system, and this is where it's coming from. But now we've managed to kind of transition to the DHIS2, and throughout that process is where we indeed explored all the 4 tools that we'll be talking about. A background of the project itself: in total, there are 11 data collection tools or forms. The tools are used to collect information across different levels of data. From the beneficiary level data, these are the farmers who are organized into individuals and producer organization groups. Equally, data was being collected about financial institutions that were supporting the farmers, the farms that were also engaged in the lifetime of the project. There was some training activity for the beneficiaries that had to be captured into the system. And eventually, also, there were some quarterly reports that had to be captured for the different institutions that were working under the project. So looking at the 11 data collection tools, the architect is that we are basically tracking all the information. So the best approach was kind of to have a model whereby you had mostly tracker programs being the majority of the design, and then we had some 2 event programs for the training activities, and then we have the data set. That was the architect that went into the design of into the system. So of course, with that, there was the aspect of now having to import the historical data. And with that, we explored a number of tools. So looking at the list of tools here, most of them could be familiar to you. We have the native DHIS2 import and export tool. This is within DHIS2 application itself, where you can be able to import event data or track instance data. But of course, before doing that, you must do an initial work of preparing the standard files to be imported. With that, then we looked at the BulkLoad EyeSeeTea, a BulkLoad tool that has been developed by EyeSeeTea. One of the tools that we also created, and it was quite in handy. My colleague Brandon is going to also talk a lot about this. Here's just giving an overview. And then we have the DataZ by BAO Systems, which we also used in the process after kind of coming across some challenges that we're facing in either of the tools that we're using above, the native import, export, and the DataZ tool. And the BAO Import Foundry tool was really, really handy when it came to generating the UIDs. So these are the combination of tools that we used. And lastly, we had the R kind of scripts, and I'll talk about my experiences with regard of using R in converting the file to get it ready for import. Right, so here I'll be talking about my previous experiences with regards to data preparation and import. And largely this is what I brought in, and we did the import of the data. So there are different data sources and applications, starting from Excel files, the Open Data Kit file. There was some direct integration of the data that was involved. These data came in different formats. We had the CSV format, which had to be in that right standard, which I'll show you shortly, or we had to use a JSON format to do the import. And the import process that I used was after preparing the file, I used the import export app, and also for JSON, I used the CAL interface to push the data into DHIS2. Briefly looking at the journey of the data kind of migration, data coming in from Enketo, largely was sitting in MySQL. Brandon went through it, cleaned it up, put this up into an Excel file, which I picked it from there, and pushed it through an R script, which I'll be taking you through. And then from the R script, eventually generated a CSV file, which you can see below. And the CSV file is what I used to import into the import and export app feature. So from this whole process, of course, there are challenges with the import and export app, whereby some of the imports was not fully importing. I got into a continuous loop while trying to do the import. The feedback that was coming through was not really pointing me to where things were fading apart. And that's where then we had this opportunity to explore the many different tools. So here is the process. Looking back at the previous screen, the process was the same, and the data transformation basically from an input file from Excel. So we followed a similar path, and putting the file into, first I had to create an SOP, which I'll show you, a two-page SOP with 8 steps on how this data can be transformed. The file was then passed into an R script, which then the output was used again in CAL and an API push to transfer into DHIS2. Here I won't go much, but it's just the SOP that I created with the 8 steps. I'll go into the details, talking about the different sections of the standard file that is required for the data import. So this is part of the SOP. So because we realized that the bulk load template comes with a number of good features, it was pulling all the UIDs. So the source first came from the bulk load data, picking the different data sources over there from the historical data. The objective was now to prepare a file that can be able to now convert into the right standard. So the first part of the file comprised of those columns, and all these columns you initially have to know all the UIDs, which are picked and inserted in all those areas. The objective, step 4, was to make sure that you transform all the variables columns into key value kind of paired, whereby you have only 2 columns for the data elements and a column for the values. And then the last part of the file comprised of the 5 columns that you see below. Here, briefly, on top is the input file. You can see highlighted in yellow. Those are the variables, and this is just one of the many files that we're looking into. Others had several variables, but this was just a very small file. Below in green is the expected output file, the data of the 5 columns converted into briefly into the two key value into the key value kind of structure. Here is the R script. That's where you started from. I mean, if you're conversant with R, then you have to go through different steps whereby within R, now I imported the file that I've just shown you previously there as our input, took it through a number of scripts, and all the conversion was done. So as you see at the end of it all, the output was a kind of a JSON file and also at the same time a CSV file. So R came in handy to start with to kind of generate these files. Eventually now with the output files, then there are those 3 kind of approaches. Either use the import export app to import the CSV file or the JSON file. Of course, it came with challenges. Or one instance, use the Postman or use a curl. So these are the different scenarios that we used, and each one of them had different capabilities. With that, I'll hand over to Brandon to take us through the next part.
Great. Can you let me know when you can see my screen?
Yep, we can see your screen.
Great. So I'm going to talk through the different tools that we looked at in addition to import-export. But before I do that, I wanted to talk a little bit through the data cleaning and prep process. And it's a little nerdy and techy, but when I first got this, I looked at the amount of data and I said, hey, it's 42,000 people. It's about 4,300 classes. You know, the biggest table may be 90,000 attendance records. And I looked at it and I said, hey, that's not a huge amount of data. But the key thing and lesson learned for me is that you really can't underestimate the amount of time that it'll take. It's not really the size of the data, but as Tony said earlier, it's the complexity. It's 11 different forms. It's a bunch of different program stages. And so it was really a decent amount of work to map all the existing tables into program stages. You need to use a SQL developer tool. You need somebody who is really good at SQL and either understands the data him or herself or can converse really well with the project team. A few challenges we faced when we were doing this conversion, as Tony mentioned, Boolean data, the fact that you've got in DHIS2 yes, no, or yes only, getting that into the correct form. Dates and date time can be really ugly. Sometimes it's in text form, sometimes it's timestamps you don't need. Key thing from a DHIS2 perspective is organization units. In the existing data, a lot of times there are org units that are in plain text. And, in particular, this was Egypt. A lot of it had been translated from Arabic. Things aren't always spelled or punctuated the same way, but it happens a lot in countries that use English characters or Latin characters as well. For example, I've worked with countries that are Francophone, and locations are not always spelled or punctuated the same way. So mapping that to the correct OUs is a huge task. Same thing for options. Tony created a ton of options, but you still have to look through the data and make sure, are all the crops that appear in the data actually options that have been created in DHIS2. There's discussion with the project team about business logic. For example, we had categorization of different classes, questions on how to handle missing data. Is it 0? Is it left out? Is it an NA? There can be junk characters, things like new lines that will absolutely wreak havoc with a CSV file. And finally, making sure that everything gets exported in UTF-8 format. Obviously, this again was Arabic, had some Arabic names in there, but it's important really, I think, even for for almost all languages, you can get unexpected characters. So Tony went through the import-export tool, which was a little technical, and we saw an opportunity to really look at some of the other tools that had been created. And the first one we went to, I think suggested by Matt Boddy, our colleague, was BulkLoad by EyeSeeTea. This is the first screen of BulkLoad. It lets you download a template. The template comes in with all of your options, so super helpful. And you can also include all the organization units. So a nice thing you can do is you can check a box, select everything at the village level, and it will put all of that metadata into the template. The thing that I really liked about BulkLoad is it produces a really, really user-friendly template in Excel. It looks like this. You have a column so this is creating tracked entity instances, for example, creating all the people who went to classes. So you can specify exactly what ID you want them to have. It makes it very easy to go back and check that they got created correctly. There are drop-down boxes for all of the organization units and the options, so you can make sure that you spelled them correctly. And one nice thing is if you're cutting and pasting into here, it will let you put something that is not in the metadata in, but it'll highlight it in red. So it's very easy to check and see if you've got an org unit that hasn't been created or hasn't been connected to the program stage. You can see along the bottom, every tab is a different program stage. Everything that's required has a little asterisk next to it. So a very user-friendly template. I do want to give a shout out to the Biff, the BAO Import Foundry. We didn't use Biff extensively in this project, but one thing that I love about Biff and that I know that they always cover in the training is this UID generator. You can do this through the API, but really Biff is super handy. You can just tell it, I want 100 new IDs, click process, and then there's actually a copy button, and it makes it very easy to take these, copy them, and put them right in the first column here. So things went pretty well with BulkLoad. As I mentioned, very user-friendly. When you import things, you get good error messages, so you know which fields failed and why. There were some cons. The first one is not really a BulkLoad issue, it's more of a browser issue. But there's really a practical limit on how many rows you can do at once. That's because it is sending thousands of API calls back and forth. And if you have too many, it just crashes your browser tab. I'm using Google Chrome. It's a great browser, but you still have to really do some experimentation to figure out how many rows you can do. And in this case, it wound up only being about 500 rows at a time. As Tony mentioned, there were definitely some difficulties we had importing yes and no fields and yes only fields. And most critically, unfortunately, the tool stopped working for us after we created about 33,000 instances. So that led us into a situation where we needed to do some debugging. So Tony and Matt Boddy took a look at what was happening with BulkLoad. Unfortunately, what they discovered was there's at least one call that involved passing all of the IDs, all the created IDs back in a parameter. So once you passed 32,000 IDs, it actually triggered an error, I think, in Postgres. So unfortunately, this error persisted. We couldn't really work around it. We tried turning duplicate detection off. So we really hit a wall with BulkLoad at this point. This led us to doing some experimentation with other tools. We still had the DHIS2 import export, which Tony had experience with, use of JSON rather than CSV. We used BulkLoad a little bit more because we found that we could take some of our smaller data sets and create them in dev. So for example, we had a few hundred producer organizations or a few dozen firms that were associated with the project. We could put those in dev, and then Tony was able to copy them up to prod. But what really cracked it for us was switching over to DataZ to do the second half of our import or migration. DataZ is a tool by BAO. pros and cons related to BulkLoad. It doesn't have quite as friendly a template. You really have to build your own template in CSV format. Templates look like this. So, you have to specify the IDs for the program, the tracked entity instance, the org unit. All of these are things you have to look up and put code in for. And then everything that is a data element goes along the top, and you have to have the exact UID for the data element. And then when you actually put in the data, it's in plain text, although it does have to be spelled correctly. This is actually an interesting thing where I went back to the BulkLoad template, the really friendly Excel one. And one of the things I liked about the template was each of these cells, for example, national ID, has the data element ID encoded in it. So you can actually take these out of here and build your own template in DataZ. I should note otherwise that Excel template from BulkLoad is pretty locked down. It's password protected. You really can't hack it in many ways. When you do an import with DataZ, this is what it looks like. It's pretty straightforward. What is nice is you upload your file and then it stages it. So for example, if I do 500 records at a time, it'll put it in this pending bucket. That gives you a little more control. It checks to see is the file in the correct format. If you have this validation check option on, it will do a bunch of other checks, things like duplicates and I don't know what else, like data types or maybe option sets. But it stages it first, and then you click this process button when you are ready to actually pull the trigger. Successful rows will be listed here, and it's highlighted in pink, unsuccessful rows in blue. And as I mentioned, as with BulkLoad, it has a pretty good log where you can see what failed, and it'll explain why. For example, this row failed, row 400 failed because it's an organization unit not found. So it made it very easy to correct it. So again, staging the data was really good. You still have kind of the same problem with browser crashing and the amount of memory that it can do. In fact, I suggest turning off the validation once you've tested one or two files. The validation option really, again, multiplies the number of API calls by 5 or 6, I think. So it can really take down a browser tab. So I usually turned it down because the error messages were good enough. The only other con that I really ran into with DataZ was that you couldn't specify the IDs for events. And it's helpful to know the exact ID of something you're creating, so then you can go in and double check it. So I'm going to turn it back over to Tony to talk through our summary and lessons learned.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. So in terms of summary, as you can see, having taken you through all the different tools, the main tools here really was the BulkLoad and DataZ in terms of the features that really kind of eventually helped us move forward. But looking at the first tool, which is the native DataZ Import Export app, certainly the interface is good because you have different options of uploading JSON, CSV, XML file, but there's quite a lot of work to be done before you can actually go and hit the import button. So for instance, no template provided, you need to kind of develop your own template based on the documentation. The BulkLoad, as we've seen, a very nice template, easy to use, bringing in quite a number of USD, which you will have otherwise gone back to DataZ and copy them and transferring them back and forth. However, looking at the DataZ, eventually what we used in the end, it worked pretty well in terms of pushing quite a lot of data, which was indeed there, even though, of course, that you had to do some little bit of extra work on the putting data into the template. But all in all, I mean, all of them had some nice features in terms of the staging, as is being spoken about. when you look at the R package, that is one area that you wouldn't go there unless you're really, really good on the R package. Of course, with an SOP and some good learning, of course, there's a steep learning curve over there. Then you could use the R package to do all this manipulation, from the manipulation of the input file to the output of JSON export up to the import. And by far, I think that was the most complex bit. And I would say this is a kind of a very, very subjective analysis based on our experiences. I'm sure having been able to interact with them, but at least we value the fact that eventually you manage to get down to the task of importing all the data. And next slide. Yeah, so for lessons learned, indeed, this was quite a huge endeavor and certainly not fit for one person. I would say it really required a lot of collaboration, team effort, starting from the technical team, where Brandon had some good background knowledge of the legacy setup of Encarto and HS2, MySQL. Then I came in handy with my kind of R script for the first step. Matt Buddy also came in to help there in terms of the identifying and taking us through some steps of troubleshooting in the DataZ process. And of course, also much appreciation to the project team, specifically the MAL team, who actually directed us clearly into the different kind of understanding the data, how it's structured, where the different reporting units are set up. So that collaboration team is indeed required for whenever you're doing this legacy kind of history imports. Secondly, I will say don't underestimate the complexity of data. Prep, cleaning, no matter how small that data is. And overall, I would say, given the different tools that you have, you might realize that probably you might need to use one or two to complement one another for you to be able to achieve your case of data import. So with that, I think those are our experiences, and we are done with the presentation. Thank you.
Nice. Thank you very much, Tony and Brandon. That was very insightful and valuable information for anybody considering these different tools. You might have saved a lot of heartache and stress for people in the future. So with that, yeah, as your last slide said, it's time for Q&A. So we actually had one question come in early on during your presentation, and it's from Monica Lopez, and she asks, did the project consider another mobile data collection tool like DHIS2 Tracker or ComCare? And what was the reason for using ODK?
I don't know a lot about the history of the project. I do know that it was put together pretty quickly using tools that were open source, with the idea of getting it up and running quickly. They hadn't really talked about DHIS2 Tracker. It wasn't really on their radar at the inception of the project. But as the difficulty of using the Enketo forms and ODK collect kind of grew and grew, and you go through quarterly reporting cycles, and it just became very cumbersome. We started talking to them. Tony and I are part of the DHIS2 solution team at Abt about really how DHIS2 and Tracker, could help alleviate those problems. And so that's, I think, when they decided to make the switch.
Thanks. Yes, and Monica, she added now to her question with a comment and saying that her question was related to having a standard tool so that some of the data cleaning issues could be averted. So
Yeah, I think Tony can speak to this more, but part of Abt Associates' effort in switching over to DHIS2 is to really work toward standardization. Tony, what are your thoughts on that?
Yep. Yeah. So basically, the idea is to actually bring in together all projects in one ecosystem. So we have what is known as the AMI, Apt Monitoring Evaluation Ecosystem, where we have a number of tools. DHIS2 being one of them, of course, there are a number of tools over there. So depending on the project's needs, then we evaluate and say, okay, this tool will be best suited for the kind of work that you want to do. But in terms of routine monitoring data collection and mobile data collection, then the idea is to recommend DHIS2 largely because of its different kind of a data collection, data analysis, and kind of the data management. So that is the ecosystem that you have, and you're trying to kind of bring on board other people who are using mobile application into now the AMI environment based on their needs.
Yeah, and we're really moving toward it for a variety of different projects. We had some legacy DHIS2 for HIV projects and for malaria projects, as you just saw in a previous presentation. But we've been, as part of making this our standard approach, broadening what it can do. And in fact, bringing in the ERAS program in Egypt was part of, showing that it could be a very successful implementation for an agriculture project, for example.
Thanks. Your colleague Sarah, she had written earlier on in the chat, to everybody listening in, that there may be reference to AMEE during your presentation, which is Apt's monitoring and evaluation ecosystem. I was just wondering, we have a little bit of time. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about what that is.
Okay. Sure, I can brief you on that. So AMI, as you see, it's an ecosystem, and within it, there are several components. So included DHIS2 being one of them, but kind of one of the components. We also have the visualization softwares like Tableau. We also have ODK and a variety of options that are there that the projects can be able to pick up from. So the idea was to kind of have this large ecosystem whereby if a project has a need for M&D data collection, then you say, okay, this is what we have. This is our ecosystem. These tools can be able to talk to one another. For your case, DHIS2 is more suitable for it, or ODK or Enkelto. So it's likely kind of encompasses not just DHIS2, but a number of tools from data collection, analysis, and visualization tools.
Thanks. That's great. I just want to let everybody know there's a poll you'll see chat and Q&A, and Tony's put in a poll. So it'd be interesting to see what our attendees, which tools they're already familiar with, or if there's another one that that's not listed here. So we still have time for some more questions, if or comments from our attendees. So please don't be shy. Here's your chance to speak with experts. And I also want to mention that Abt Associates has a booth in our virtual expo hall, and the hall is open throughout the entire symposium. And there's dedicated time tomorrow where attendees can come and learn more about the diverse work that Abt Associates is doing around the world and the impact that they're having. So I invite everybody to visit the booth and ask questions, and I'll continue asking questions here. As we're waiting for maybe last questions, I don't know if there's anything more, Brandon and Tony, that you want to touch on, provide us a little more detail on something that maybe you've already spoken about.
Tony, do you want to mention some of the other projects that are part of the AMI ecosystem now?
Yep. So we do, okay, first how AMI is set up, DataZ2, we kind of have a shared instance whereby we put some projects that we feel do not require a dedicated area. And on this instance, we have projects across different countries within Africa, Central Asia, and that's I think South Africa. The projects range from health components, about 2 of them have some in government, one in governance, and then there's now the one for agriculture. This one is on a dedicated space because really we didn't want to kind of mix mostly health related and agri because it was kind of a pioneering. But we have about 4 different focus areas that are sitting on the shared instance: health, health financing, governance. Those are the kind of the projects that are sitting on the AMI instance.
Great, thanks. We have a question in from Lauren Fragosi, and she's asking if you tested the HISP Uganda import app, and if yes, what made you choose another import method?
Yeah, okay, yes, I did have a look at that. And one kind of, I'm not sure if it was because we are running on DataZ 2.36, and I guess somehow there's something which I couldn't be able to do, and I felt maybe it was a compatibility issue. I didn't explore that further, but indeed I did have a look at that. However, at the end, we settled on the other 2 tools. But probably this is one of the tools that can be able to be evaluated. I think it's something that I would also like to have a look at it. Recommendation: if it has some nice templates, especially in Excel, then it would be a good addition to the number of import tools that people want to look into. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, I think there's, yes, Lauren said thank you. So is there anything more you wanted to share with us on this, or anything else of your exciting work?
I'm looking at the polls.
Oh, okay.
And I see most people are using the DataZ2 native import exports. Mm-hmm. My kind of thoughts here is, how do they get that final output file? I'm sure there's a process that they have to take it through, and I'm wondering what that process is. Is it the same experiences like what I've gone through, like using a custom R to create an ONO script? So just looking at it, I'm just keen to find out what methods they're using to get that final output file.
Yes, we're almost at time, but people can write quickly here in the chat, or during this symposium, people can reach out with direct messages to Tony and Brandon to answer that question. Yeah, Lauren says that they use R and also make them manually.
Yeah, so a little programming, and I'm not a good R programmer. I'm a better Python programmer, but yeah, you do have to have a little bit of programming experience to use that. I think we're running up on time, but thanks again to BAO, and thanks to our project team. We couldn't have done this without them, and Tony and I will be at the booth tomorrow, so stop by our booth if you'd like to know more about our experiences.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for sharing what you found out, the advantages, the gaps, and for, this is what the symposium is about, sharing your stories and experiences and lessons learned. So thank you so much for doing that for us.